Welcome, everybody. Good to have you here. It's been a while since we did a Facebook Live, and we're back again. And what we want to do is feature guests that can really tout immune resilience, giving us what we need to know on the front of nutrition, botanical medicine, lifestyle medicine. And that will really set the stage for our conference, which is happening in November 12th and 13th. Make sure that you sign up if you haven't already, theana.org, and you can also find the information on this page. So our guest today is Dr. Lise Alschuler, and I was telling our backstage team, Meredith, and even Dr. Alschuler, I've been looking forward to this because I know Lise quite well. She's quite accomplished, especially in the arena of naturopathic medicine, botanical medicine, I would say oncology. I mean, she's written books, she has consumer books, she has books for health professionals, and her books are typically amongst the repertoire of books that I'm recommending for various groups, depending on what they are. She's here today to talk with us about botanicals for immune resilience. And I just want to, before we dive into this discussion, I just want to apprise everybody as to one of her most recent articles. And this was in Explore. You can find the entire review article online. It's open access. Thank you for doing that, Lise. It's not always easy to get articles. And she published this together with Dr. Andrew Weil, Randy Horowitz, Paul Stamets. Most people know about Paul Stamets and Fantastic Fungi, which I just watched this past weekend. And a number of different experts here really getting into integrative therapies during the COVID-19 pandemic, as it states. So welcome, Lise.
Thank you. Happy to be here with you, Deanna, of course.
You know, I'm kind of curious where you are now with the pandemic. I mean, we've got this article that was published some months ago, and I feel like every month as we move through this pandemic is very different. So we've got this beautiful article that you wrote with all of your co-authors. Where are you now as it relates to the pandemic? Just maybe give us the high-level view as to your life and what we see happening on the forefront of nutrition and botanicals for COVID-19.
Well, that article was put out really at the beginning of the pandemic, and we had very little to go on at that time. So since then, of course, there's been a lot more research that has been published. Admittedly, most of the studies that are published in the area of integrative health in relationship to COVID-19 are published prior to peer review. They're, often kind of hastily put together. So it's not the best quality of research, just generally speaking. There are some exceptions to that, of course, but, we're still learning a lot. I think most of that article still is true. Some of the things we've learned, for example, about vitamin D, since that article, I would probably change the way we describe vitamin D a little bit. In that article, we talk about potentially stopping vitamin D if you actually contract the SARS-CoV-2 virus because of the potential for vitamin D to increase inflammation. And that's still true, but the data seems to be very clear that there's an association. We don't know the directionality of the association, but there's an association between having sufficient vitamin D levels and having a lower risk of dying from COVID-19. And I think that article still has some elements of truth to it because more is not better with vitamin D. There's a U-shaped curve to it. So, just taking a bunch of it with the idea that you're helping yourself, actually you start to negate the benefits of vitamin D. It's very much a law of diminishing returns with vitamin D. So there's an element of truth, but I think it's a little bit more nuanced now than it was in March when we came out with that article. And I think also since that article, we've really begun to understand this illness a little bit more. I think the long hauler syndrome is really significant. Even people with very mild disease, about a third of them go on to develop this long hauler syndrome, which can affect them in a myriad of ways, relatively unpredictable, very healthy people to start. And that has kind of led us down this idea of different underlying pathophysiology that has more to do with the ACE2 receptor and some other cofactors involved. So, I think that there's still a lot we don't know. So tagging onto all of that, integrative therapies, and we're sort of left with this big question mark. So we just have to really make educated decisions and do the best we can, mostly applying data from other viral infections.
Right. And if you could talk just a little bit more about what you were saying with vitamin D. So what would be a good target level in your opinion?
We don't really know for sure, which is interesting, but almost all of the data on vitamin D that shows benefit in especially immune-related conditions makes a distinction or shows that benefit when people are sufficient, which is defined either as 20 nanograms per milliliter or as 30 nanograms per milliliter, depending on which study you're reading. So we know that at least that much appears to be beneficial. For the immune system, it also appears that we need a little bit more than that for optimal function, but that past about 40, maybe 50, you start to see diminishing returns. So there's a fairly, I think, tight sweet spot for vitamin D, somewhere between 20 and 40 nanograms per milliliter. And this is very condition specific. For example, in the oncology world, we use vitamin D a lot for its effect or its association with reduced risk of cancer-related mortality. And in a very good study on people with breast cancer, the sweet spot for vitamin D appeared to be between 40 and 60 nanograms per milliliter. So there's a little bit of a different sweet spot, but generally speaking, I haven't seen anything that shows benefit above 60, greater than 40 or 30, and in fact, some indication that it starts to create problems at that higher level. Some resistance mechanisms kick in. There's pathways that were downregulated become upregulated. So I think that we have to be careful with vitamin D. More is not better. I really am very firmly of that belief camp now.
Yeah, that's such a good point. What about the nutrigenetic aspect and looking at VDR, vitamin D receptor, people who have polymorphisms and who may not be able to effectively utilize vitamin D? I think that our level of sophistication, it will grow as we continue to be looking at these different SNPs.
Yeah, for sure. And the polymorphisms, not only in the vitamin D receptor, but there's also polymorphisms that have been found in the vitamin D carrier protein, which can affect how much vitamin D people can transport to their tissues. There's there's polymorphisms in the enzymes that metabolize vitamin D. So all aspects of vitamin D metabolism can be affected by SNPs, which certainly calls forward the importance of personalizing vitamin D recommendations. Very likely people with a combination of those SNPs would benefit from more rather than less. But again, we don't really know how much more they need.
Yeah, it's tricky. The other one that presents itself this way, another nutrient, is zinc. So with zinc, we know that there is a toxic level of zinc, but it's very difficult for people to figure out, am I zinc sufficient, insufficient, or deficient? Mm-hmm. So how do you navigate that one? Because I know that all the talk about zinc ionophores and looking at catechins, etc. So how do we effectively look at zinc?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know, how we determine good zinc. I think looking at red blood cell levels of zinc are probably more accurate than looking at serum zinc. And what the optimum value, though, for the red blood cell zinc is I think also not only, it's not something we can really answer by just looking at zinc, because zinc obviously has a relationship with other minerals too. So we have to look at copper status and maybe even iron status and vitamin C status. And, there's ways in which the cell can utilize zinc more efficiently or less efficiently. So yeah, it's very complex. I think when it gets that complex, from a very practical standpoint, it makes sense to me to at least ensure that people have sufficient zinc from a dietary perspective, first and foremost, as kind of a preventive or prophylactic. And then during, let's say, a pandemic or somebody's at risk for developing some sort of upper respiratory tract infection, or maybe even has early symptoms, I think it makes sense to take extra zinc just for a short period of time, because there's really not going to be any harm for short-term higher dose zinc. And I think there's potential benefit.
Yes, and I really like what you said about the relationship with other minerals and even vitamins like vitamin C. I think that's one of the missing factors in nutrition sometimes is when, and we're seeing this with vitamin D, where it's almost like if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you hear about vitamin D being really good for the immune system, then it's like, okay, everything is vitamin D. But then we need to look at vitamin D in relationship to vitamin K, K1, K2, calcium, magnesium, the larger complex. I think nutrition is more about relationship. And we miss that sometimes when we just have these solo messages that go out there as a fix it message, but we can actually be doing ourselves, non-benefit if we don't look at the larger context.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think you've been a really strong advocate of that for a long time with your whole foods approach to health. You can't really go wrong with eating food-based nutrients because there's a plethora of minerals, vitamins, flavonoids, all of which interact together and support our cellular health. So I think that's always a safe fallback. I think where it gets tricky is when we're trying to use these nutrients as therapeutic tools. And because of the reductionistic nature of how we approach understanding health and disease, we typically are looking at studies that have isolated one of these compounds and look for a result. And, so how applicable is that to real life? I think, you're right. It's sort of questionable a lot of the time.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you and I have in common, we have many things in common, but one is our love of plants.
Yes.
And what you just mentioned, you said flavonoids there. I caught that. And so and it's true. Like if we were to stick to a plant-based diet, no matter what our eating dogma is, it doesn't matter if we're keto, paleo, vegan, vegetarian, whatever we are, plants. And you've been singing that same tune over all these years. So, and one of the things about plants that I like is that they're modulators, right? So they have a complex web of different things. But are there certain things in plants that you might focus on therapeutically that could help us with our immune system, where we might take things in isolation and then use them in this way? What are your thoughts on the whole versus now how do we start to effectively use things like targeted flavonoids as a therapeutic agent?
So, so first of all, I think one of the main ways in which I think about flavonoids related to the immune system is their role in reducing NF-kappa B activation. So NF-kappa B is nuclear factor kappa B. It's really one of the main drivers of the inflammatory response in cells. So when NF-kappa B is released in the cytoplasm, translocates through the nuclear membrane, binds to various response elements throughout the genome, and upregulates the production of its estimated 400 proteins that are involved in the inflammatory response. So it is the ignition switch for an inflammatory response. And whenever we react to something, a threat immunologically, we need that inflammatory response as part of our immunological defense. But if that inflammation continues unabated, then we move into tissue destruction. And that's where diseases can get very problematic. And that's really part of the pathophysiology, for example, with COVID-19, but that's true for really any chronic sequelae from an infection. So I think flavonoids, one of the things they do really importantly is that they help to quell that inflammatory response. And interestingly, a lot of the flavonoids that have been studied not only provide that anti-inflammatory action, but at the same time don't interfere with, especially that initial innate immune response to a pathogen. In fact, a lot of flavonoids increase, let's say, the activation of natural killer cells or macrophage activation. So it sort of has this beautiful ability to orchestrate our immune reaction in a way that's less damaging to us. And some of the heavy hitters in that regard would be quercetin, top of my list. Quercetin is a zinc ionophore that you mentioned earlier, but it also is just really well suited to doing what I just mentioned. The catechins found in the tea plant are also very good at this. Of course, curcumin from turmeric root has a role to play in this regard. So I think, some of these commonly known flavonoids can be used in a sort of extracted way. Even in that sense, though, flavonoids, even as extracts, are always more beneficial when they're used in combination with each other than they are singly. So even if I were to say recommend quercetin to somebody, I would look for either a product that has quercetin and curcumin and maybe some resveratrol or something like that, or I would supplement with additional flavonoids and certainly provide those on the context or foundation of a plant-based diet, which is rich in the thousands of flavonoids that we eat when we eat plants.
Absolutely. Yeah, they work as a team, right? And one of the things I think about with it being the end of September is my apple trees that are in full abundance right now.
Yes.
It's really beautiful how nature provides during the times of the year when we might need it most. And I know you're in Arizona. Are you still in Arizona?
I am, yes.
Okay.
We don't have apples.
You don't have it?
Yes, we do in some parts of Arizona, not in my house, though.
No, but I think of, with our apple tree just over in abundance, how apples as a source of quercetin, it's somehow, if we were to eat the foods that we get during that season, then our physiological needs, with it being September, October, more allergies, more potential flus and colds, to really make the most of those foods. What is your take on eating seasonally? I mean, I would think that you are very much connected into those rhythms of nature.
I think there's a lot of wisdom to that. I think primarily it's, when you eat seasonally, you're going to be eating fresher foods, so they're going to be more nutritious.
Yeah.
So I think there's that. I think there's obviously an environmental plus too, in that seasonally eating is generally more local eating, so there's also less transportation from far areas of the world. So I think it's ideal. I think that depending on the region in which you live, the ability to eat seasonally can be a little bit different. Like in Arizona, obviously we're in a desert, and it's a fairly plant-filled desert. Actually, it's really one of the world's most plant-filled deserts, the Sonoran Desert. And we do have a lot of foods that we can eat locally. The indigenous peoples would eat a lot of cactus, for example, but those are kind of not necessarily seasonally, although the fruits of cactus are somewhat seasonal. We grow onions here, so we could eat onions seasonally, another source of quercetin. But our ability to eat seasonally and really to get a full complement of nutrients, I would say, is a little compromised down here in the desert. Whereas when I grew up in New England, I think that's where you can really eat seasonally in a really wonderful way.
And perhaps because you don't have the same extremes in Arizona, right? And so the buffer, the range that you are navigating is potentially much less than somebody in a different part of the country like New England, where that range is much greater in different. And so maybe more support is required.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Well, and I'm kind of curious too, because one of the other ways to be getting a lot of these nutrients is not only through food, but through teas and beverages. And, I recently was looking at a paper in which they looked at different teas, different plants that were used, and how they were comparable in their antioxidant potential to even a serving of vegetables. So I'm thinking even in certain parts of the country or the world where we don't have accessibility, teas, other things like that can be within our reach.
Absolutely. I love that you brought up teas. I think teas have the potential to be so medicinal because a lot of these flavonoids actually generally are very water extractable. So it doesn't take a lot of effort to get the flavonoids out of a dried tea leaf, for example, in the water. And so your tea can become very medicinal. The longer you steep a tea, the more medicinal it is. The quality of your starting tea is really important too. So for example, with green tea, you want to make sure that you're getting organic green tea. Otherwise, you're going to, in addition to steeping the flavonoids, steep out a bunch of pesticides. So you don't want that. So, organic and really good dark green, especially if it's like a matcha or sencha green tea. But yeah, absolutely. Then you're getting a huge amount of flavonoids. And even some of the herbs that we think about that have that we may not think about from an immune context, but that will influence our immunity indirectly. So I'm thinking, for example, of peppermint tea or chamomile tea. These are teas which also have flavonoids and volatile oils, which are anti-inflammatory. And because of their nervine impacts, they can mitigate the stress response. And chronic stress, it definitely increases the inflammatory aspect of our immune response. So that over time will help us have a more orderly, less damaging immune reaction. So I think those kind of medicinal teas are helpful as well.
Yeah, really good points here. And I like the idea of mints and different kinds.
Mm-hmm.
One of my friends, Barb Scholl, she does not like the taste of green tea. She finds it too bitter, but she uses it as a base for her smoothie so that it becomes masked, which I thought was a really interesting idea. I don't know if you have any pearls for us as to how do we get more plants in our everyday eating? Do you have things that you talk with your patients about that are kind of, well, for lack of a better word, hacks, or, you know, just tips, different things that we can do that probably most people aren't thinking of?
Well, let's see. I love that smoothie idea, and I definitely agree with that. And I think that, you know, certain like green tea is really amenable to that because you can buy matcha powder and sencha powder, so it's easy to add. I really I think about spices too. You know, a lot of the spices we have in our cabinet are essentially plant medicines, and they've just been dried and in some cases powdered. So if they're relatively fresh, meaning 6 months old or younger, and they've been kept in a nice, cool, dry cabinet, they are medicinal. And the more of them that we get into our diet, the more antioxidants we have, more anti-inflammatory effects we get. Most of them actually are antimicrobial. So we get some direct antimicrobial effects. So I think spices are a really good way to sneak some plant foods into our diet.
I love that. I love that. You know, in India, in March, at the end of the month, the Ministry of Ayush, which is kind of the Ayurvedic segment of kind of the Ministry of Health, and they put out a guidance on golden milk and different spices to be including in your everyday eating to help with immunity. So I love what you just said because it's so true. It's like right now in our kitchen, we have this little pharmacy, which is our spice rack. Yeah. As long as they're fresh. You made the point about making sure that we don't keep them to the point that, you know, we're not using them. They're just sitting there. They get caked and old. They actually become more filled with peroxides rather than the antioxidants that we're looking for.
Right. Yeah, you know, and I think not to underestimate this, I can't remember the exact data, but there was a study that came out several years ago, and it was a study on Indian, I think it was Indian men, and they looked at men their consumption of curry frequency, and it was like curry once a week, curry a couple times a month, curry once a month, and then their lung function. And basically even just eating curry, I believe it was just once a week, there was an association with improved pulmonary function. I mean, that's just so simple, delicious, and easy. So I think, you know, sometimes it's those kind of studies which really make me remember the potent nature of these spices. I think we can forget because they're just part of cooking, you know, who cares? But they're actually medicine for us.
They are medicine. That's a really good point. And there are so many studies on turmeric. And even to know that cooking and preparation is key with the medicinal impact of turmeric, that it needs a little bit of heat in order to help its transformation and its action in our bodies. And, you know, one of the things that intrigues me too is, you know, how do we put things together so that we're emphasizing its medicinal properties? So turmeric and a little bit of oil and heat. And if I even think of green tea with citrus flavonoids, potentiating the catechin content. I don't know if you want to leave us with any other idea. I know that there are a lot of nutrition professionals listening in, and so we're always thinking about these things for our clients, for ourselves, and your great wisdom in this arena. But
I mean, I guess the one thing I would say about that is that flavonoids are very heat stable. So I think it's just important to remember that it's fine to cook our vegetables and we'll still get lots of these benefits. they're just really hard to destroy with heat. So, I mean, that's helpful because I think sometimes patients or whomever feel like they have to just eat a bunch of salad all the time. And
Right.
that's not easy for everybody to digest salad a lot every day. So cooked vegetables are fine.
Yeah. And just to the point of not overcooking, right? We don't want
Right.
our vegetables to turn brown because then we start to get all these kind of rancid kind of products.
Mm-hmm.
Lise, this has been great. Thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge about immunity, botanicals. I mean, obviously we can go on and on, but I wanted to give listeners a little bit of a bird's eye view into what we're going to be talking about at the conference coming up in November. So November 12th and 13th, that it's all online. The first day is all a business forum, and the second day will be science and clinical application. So I'm really excited about it. And we'll be talking plants for sure. So I'm excited. And for those of you who want more information on Dr. Alschuler, please look her up. And don't forget this article that she published. This is available online, so you can easily find this. Lots of good data coming out. You know, I'm constantly tracking this stuff through PubMed, and you're right. It's been changing a lot as we learn more about the virus.
Yes.
So, thank you so much, Dr. Alschuler. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Always fun to talk with you.
Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.